Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we talked about moral relativism. We gave the distinction between personal relativism and cultural relativism. We noticed that there were certain difficulties that the relativist may run into, but also that there are crucial insights that the relativist notices. The difficulty with the relativist's view is that they mistake descriptive ethics for normative ethics or meta-ethics, and we saw the repercussions of that. Now, the insight that the relativist has is that ethics is personal. It is always an individual, concrete human being practicing ethics. Persons are concrete, not abstract. Now, in this lecture, we will take a look at one possible response to moral relativism, a position known as ethical egoism. Ethical egoism will attempt to accept what is true from the relativist while refining things that appeared problematic. And so in this lecture, we will look at what ethical egoism is, we'll see why it's appealing, and then we'll look at some potential objections that some might bring, which will basically leave us to see whether or not ethical egoism stands against scrutiny. And so first, what is ethical egoism? Ethical egoism is the view that we morally ought to act in our own self-interest. Our own personal flourishing is the standard for what is right or wrong. Now notice the careful distinction that the ethical egoist makes. He is not saying that people do act for their own self-interest. He is saying that we should act for our own self-interest, where our own self-interest means our own personal flourishing. And this seems to make sense, at least in our own day. In our own day, we talk about, for example, self-care. We all accept that self-care days are fine to have. They're good to have because you're taking a day for yourself. You're resting and you're protecting your own well-being. Nobody would say that resting and protecting your own well-being is evil, nor is that selfish in the bad sense. It's really just you taking care of yourself. Or again, when we are hungry, we eat. But we don't say that eating is selfish. We need to eat in order to live. And so it seems pretty obvious that we can do things for ourselves that are not selfish in at least the bad sense of the term. In other words, taking care of ourselves is not selfish. In fact, we have to take care of ourselves to sometimes even do good things in the first place. Now, besides these examples, there are other appeals to ethical egoism. For example, according to the Declaration of Independence, every single individual human being has the natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are rights that we all have. The Declaration of Independence, then, acknowledges that we all have rights to pursue our own freedoms and our own flourishing. So, at least on the surface, America's moral founding is grounded on ethical egoism. The other appeal to ethical egoism is one that attempts to appeal to Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher. According to Aristotle, every single individual human being acts according to an at least apparent good. In other words, nobody seeks to do what is bad for the sake of doing bad itself. Whenever either we or somebody else does wrong, it is not because we or they want to do what's wrong, but because there is an apparent good that isn't actually there. Now, the highest good is human happiness or human flourishing. Therefore, since happiness is the greatest good, and we should always pursue what is good, it follows that we should pursue our own happiness, which is exactly what the ethical egoist claims. We should pursue our own flourishing. Now notice how this is an attempt to correct relativism. On the one hand, it accepts the fact that ethics is personal, that ethics is practical, and that we individual beings do ethics. On the other hand, it attempts to escape relativism. Rather than saying that ethics is grounded in our own personal values or in societal values or laws, the ethical egoist says that morality is grounded in our own individual human flourishing. But despite this, there are some possible objections that one might give to ethical egoism. Now, to do ethical egoism justice, and this may be a good rule for really anything in philosophy, the objections need to be internal, from within the worldview of ethical egoism, and not external, from the world outside of ethical egoism. The reason why I say that is because if we want to have good objections to anything, we have to have a shared standard, a common language, if you will, with the thing or the person that we are objecting to. But if we do not have a shared standard, then the objections become significantly weaker. And so, with that in mind, let's step into the ethical egoist worldview. Okay, the ethical egoist says that we should all pursue our own flourishing. But we have to ask, what is flourishing? Is it pleasure, money, achievement, virtue, power? It seems that the term needs defining. We need to better understand what we mean by flourishing. Now, the ethical egoist gives us a hint. If we are to pursue our own flourishing, then flourishing is just whatever's good for us, whether it be leisure or money or achievement or virtue or power. In other words, the ethical egoist will tell us that rational self-interest is good. Rational self-interest is what leads to our own flourishing. But this is where the objection begins, and this could be a bit tricky, so we have to pay special attention to what's going on. The ethical egoist tells us that rational self-interest is good. But why is it good? Is it good because it leads to happiness? Or because it respects the fact that we can exercise our freedoms? Maybe. But notice what just happened. The ethical egoist is now grounding what's good in happiness or freedom. In other words, once the ethical egoist tells us why self-interest is good, they are pointing to something beyond self-interest. But if they are pointing to something beyond self-interest, then self-interest does not ground morality. Something else does. And that's the first objection. The first objection is that once the ethical egoist tells us why self-interest is good, they have to point to something beyond self-interest. Now, the second objection is that ethical egoism seems to reduce morality to, if you don't get caught, then it's not wrong. I'll use myself as an example. Suppose it's 2:30 a.m. and I am getting my beauty sleep. But all of a sudden, my child cries in the middle of the night. Now, I'm already exhausted. The last thing that I want to do is attend to the child. Is it even in my own self-interest to help my child? I mean, all my child does right now, at least, is eat, sleep, poop, repeat. And diapers alone cost a ton. So having a child is a real financial burden. Under ethical egoism, then, why should I help my child? So let's say I don't. Let's say I just let my child cry until he or she stops and goes back to sleep. Some might think that's bad parenting, that I'm being cruel. And since I care about my own reputation, I shouldn't do something like that. But something like this could just happen in the home. As long as others don't know what I'm doing, my reputation is safe. So under ethical egoism, it's bad for me to neglect my child if I get caught, because that would harm my reputation. So, but what if I don't get caught? We could say the same for, say, speeding or drinking and driving, that it's only wrong if I get caught. The final objection that we will have to at least touch on for today, since there might be others, is that ethical egoism is actually relativism in disguise. Again, let's step into the ethical egoist worldview. In ethical egoism, we should all act according to our own rational self-interest. Now, our own rational self-interest is going to be different. For example, my self-interest may be different from your own self-interest. We might even have contradictory self-interests. For example, I may want a certain candidate to go into office because I would gain financial benefit from his policies. But those same policies may hurt you. So it would seem in my self-interest to elect him, and in your self-interest not to elect him. It would be good for me and bad for you. Now, if our self-interests are different, but morality is grounded and based on our self-interests, then it seems that what's moral is going to be different for different people, which is exactly what moral relativism teaches. And so, ironically, in trying to fight against moral relativism, the ethical egoist actually succumbs to it. And so, overall, where does this leave us in respect to ethical egoism? Like moral relativism, there are certain important truths that the ethical egoist directs our attention toward. For example, not only is ethics personal, but it is something that makes us, as individuals, better, not worse. What counts as flourishing is where the debate really lies. If all flourishing is just different for different people, then ethical egoism reduces to relativism. But if flourishing is not different for different people, but rather is one thing that unites all of us individuals, then the question becomes this: what is that thing? So we can thank the ethical egoist for really two reasons. First, the egoist builds upon the relativist by showing that not only is ethics personal, but it requires personal flourishing. Second, the ethical egoist is directing us to a real, meaningful conversation. We have to ask, what is flourishing? So really, in our search for what ethics is and whether we are living an ethical life, we are also seeking what it means to flourish. Ethics and flourishing are interconnected. So in understanding what ethics is, we will be able to understand what flourishing is. And in understanding what human flourishing is, we will better be able to understand what ethics is and how to live an ethical life. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.